The patient hadn't spoken in months until he whispered my name. I remembered exactly where I was standing when it happened. Outside room 309, one hand holding a clipboard, the other resting on the doorframe. The lights were low, the hallway empty, and the hospital felt like it was holding its breath. When I heard my name, it wasn't loud or sudden. It was soft, almost careful, like whoever said it didn't want to be overheard. Evan. It took a second for my brain to register what I'd heard. I turned my head, expecting to see someone behind me, maybe a nurse or another tech trying to get my attention. The hallway was empty in both directions. No footsteps, no movement, just the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant beep of a heart monitor somewhere down the wing. The sound had come from inside room 309. I worked nights at St. Andrews Regional because it paid better and because nights were easier. Fewer visitors, fewer administrators, fewer conversations.
I was a patient care tech, not a nurse or a doctor. I took vitals, helped patients move, cleaned rooms, answered call lights. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work. Night shift had its own rhythm. After midnight, the hospital felt less like a place where people came to get better and more like a place where time slowed down. Sounds carried farther. Small things felt bigger. You learned which noises to ignore and which ones meant trouble. Room 309 had been part of my routine since my first week. The patient was an elderly man, late 70s maybe, admitted after a massive stroke. He was conscious, but almost completely unresponsive. His eyes were usually open, tracking movement in the room, but he never spoke, never nodded, never reacted to questions or pain pests in any obvious way. The nurses called him the silent patient, not unkindly, just as a way to identify him. He never had visitors during my shifts. No family, no friends.
His chart mentioned a distant relative who lived out of state, but no one ever came. Some nights, I wondered if anyone outside the hospital even remembered he was still there. At first, room 309 didn't feel strange. It felt sad, in the quiet way hospitals often are. I talked to him while I worked, mostly out of habit. I told him what I was doing, warned him before I moved him, made small comments about the weather or the vending machines. I never expected a response, but complete silence felt worse somehow. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. Then I started noticing small things that didn't feel important enough to report. Sometimes when I entered the room, the TV would be on a different channel than when I left it. Sometimes it would be muted, even though I remembered leaving the volume on low. Sometimes his eyes would already be fixed on the doorway, like he'd been watching the hall.
Once or twice, I thought I heard breathing that didn't match the slow, mechanical rhythm of the monitor. A faint inhale that sounded closer than it should have been. But hospitals make noise constantly. Air vents, machines, old pipes. You learn to tune it out. One night, while I was taking his blood pressure, I noticed his lips moving slightly. Not forming words, just moving, like he was practicing. I asked if he was uncomfortable. He didn't respond. When I looked back at his face, his mouth was still. I told myself it was muscle spasms. Another night, I found the call button resting in his hand. That alone wasn't impossible. Stroke patients sometimes had moments of clarity or strength. When I mentioned it to the nurse on duty, she frowned and said he didn't have the motor control to grip things like that. She suggested someone must have left it there accidentally. I didn't argue. Things stayed just normal enough that I never officially reported anything.
I didn't want to sound paranoid. I didn't want to be the tech who thought unresponsive patients were doing things they couldn't do. Then came the whisper. After I heard my name that first time, I stood outside the room,
staring at the door longer than I should have. Part of me hoped that if I waited, the moment would fade and I could convince myself it never happened. Eventually, routine took over. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room looked the same as always. The patient lay flat in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The monitor beeped steadily. Nothing out of place. I asked if someone had called for help. No response. As I checked his vitals, I felt that familiar sensation between my shoulder blades, the feeling of being watched. When I looked down, his eyes had shifted. They were on me. I left the room unsettled, but by the end of the shift, exhaustion dulled the memory. Lack of sleep can do strange things to your mind. That's what I told myself.
The next few nights were quiet. Too quiet. Every time I walked past room 309, my chest tightened. I started finding excuses to delay going in. When I finally did, everything was normal again. About a week later, it happened again. I was adjusting his IV when I heard my name, low and strained, like it hurt to say. I dropped the line. The sound of it hitting the bed rail made me jump. His lips were slightly parted. I asked how he knew my name. My voice sounded wrong in the small room. He didn't answer. His mouth closed, and his eyes drifted back to the ceiling. I reported it to the charge nurse. She listened, then asked if I'd been sleeping enough. She suggested stress and long hours could cause auditory hallucinations. I nodded and dropped it. After that, I stopped talking to him during my rounds. I thought maybe if I treated him like an object instead of a person, whatever was happening would stop. It didn't.
Sometimes I heard soft sounds when I passed the room, like someone trying to clear their throat. Sometimes I caught fragments of words I couldn't quite understand, always stopping when I opened the door. Once, I thought I heard two voices overlapping, but when I stepped inside, there was only silence. I started having dreams about the room. In them, the patient sat upright in bed, eyes closed, whispering names over and over. Some I recognized, some I didn't. I always woke up with the same thought pressing against my mind. He knows more than he should. The night everything broke, the hospital was short-staffed. I was the only tech covering that wing. Around 3 a.m., the monitors at the nurses' station flickered, then went dark before rebooting. When they came back on, room 309 showed no vitals. I didn't call it in. I ran. When I reached the room, the lights were off. That alone was wrong. I flipped them on and froze. The patient was sitting upright in bed.
Not slumped, not struggling, sitting straight, head tilted slightly forward, eyes fixed on the doorway like he'd been waiting. He said my name again, clearer than ever. I backed into the wall, my heart pounding. I asked how he was sitting up. I asked if he was in pain. The questions felt pointless. He told me he'd been listening for months, listening to the halls, listening to the rooms. He said hospitals collect things people don't realize they leave behind. Fear, regret, last thoughts spoken too quietly for anyone to hear. He said most people pass through without noticing. I asked him what he meant. He said he wasn't supposed to wake up yet, that he'd waited too long, that once you hear enough voices, it gets harder to stay quiet. The monitors started beeping again, loud and uneven. I ran for help. When the nurses arrived, room 309 was normal. The patient lay flat, unresponsive, eyes open. The monitors showed stable vitals. No one believed me.
The next day, I was reassigned to another wing. A week later, room 309 was empty.
The patient had passed quietly during the day. No complications, no last words. I quit a month after that. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I hear my name whispered just as I'm drifting off, like it's coming from far away, filtered through walls and machines. And I always think of that room, still listening.